Britain has been hit by gales and floods. Rivers burst their banks. Hundreds of homes were flooded and families made homeless. You can't see it because my life jacket and rubber dinghy are just out of shot. The Eurozone crisis is back again, and this time it's really serious. Deadly serious. Hundreds of thousands of anti-austerity protesters took to the streets of Greece as the country was paralysed by a general strike. Protests in Spain turned violent during the week in a country where 1 in 4 is unemployed, and a further $50 billion is to be cut from spending and social care. And British Prime Minister David Cameron took time out to appear on the Letterman show and give America a bit of a history lesson.
You know, we interfered a bit in your politics about 200 years ago when we sailed up the river and burned down the White House.
And signally failed his own history test in return. Marks will be given out later, so pay attention because this is the real deal. Welcome to The Real Deal. On Press TV, still the voice of the voiceless. I'm George Galloway, and every week I'm in central London, bringing you the news and views you just won't easily find in the corporate media. Shooting from the hip and shooting from the lip as always, but if you wanted to fire back at me, you could, at least by email, at the address showing on the screen. David Cameron was in New York on Wednesday speaking at the General Assembly of the United Nations, where he launched a bitter attack on the UN over what he said was inaction on Syria. The real targets, and pretty substantial ones at that, were Russia and China, which have blocked British attempts to agree tough new resolutions condemning the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Cameron has, of course, called for the removal of Assad. He was speaking shortly after 2 massive explosions targeting the Syrian military command centre in Damascus killed at least 4 people and injured dozens of others. In the aftermath, a reporter for this TV channel, Maya Nasser, was killed by rebel sniper fire. Later in the evening, Cameron popped up on the long-running David Letterman show on US TV and was gently tested on his knowledge of British history. It's the kind of thing that immigrants must pass in David Cameron's Britain in the citizenship test, or they're on the next plane out of here. And it's fair to say that if Cameron wasn't a citizen already, he'd already be turned back at the border because, hey, he failed it. He didn't know who composed Rule Britannia, and worse, didn't know the English translation of the Magna Carta, the founding document of British democracy. It means Great Charter, Dave, and you with an Eton and Oxbridge education too. Cameron's US equivalent, no, I'll start that again. President Obama and Mitt Romney have been slugging it out in the swing state of Ohio.
I understand my opponent has been spending some time here in Ohio lately, and he's been talking tough on China. Have you been hearing this? He's been talking tough on China. He says he's going to take the fight to him. He's going to go after these cheaters. Jobs will rain down on everybody else. Deficit will magically go away. You know, when you hear this newfound outrage, when you see these ads he's running promising to get tough on China, it feels a lot like that fox saying, you know, we need more secure chicken coops. I mean, it's just not credible.
I think what he meant was, my opponent isn't just not credible, he's a dangerous man. Mitt Romney famously wrote off half of the American electorate as freeloaders who wouldn't vote for him anyway. Those that may vote for him, that's the hardline, right-wing, fundamentalist, fanatic Republicans, display a frightening, if expected, attitude to Muslims. According to a new poll of them, an overwhelming majority believe that the West and Islam are embroiled in a fundamental conflict which can only end with one side winning. So if Romney wins in November, get your order in for nuclear shelters. Market jitters over Europe's spiralling debt crisis returned after weeks of relative calm, as we predicted here last week, amid a welter of grim statistics and mass protests in Greece and Spain. Both countries are dependent on bailouts from the European Union, the Central Bank and the IMF, and those are conditional on further savage cuts hitting ordinary and poor people once more. This crisis has run and run, but I get the feeling that it won't run for much longer. It'll probably stagger to collapse. Venezuela goes to the polls next Sunday, and I will be there, so I won't be myself in this spot next week. President Hugo Chavez did hold a 10-point lead, but according to the latest polls before the election, the margin between him and his right-wing opponent, US-backed Enrique Capriles, is narrowing. I'll be reporting back on the outcome the week after next. New pictures of one of my heroes were unveiled during the week. The great Cuban leader, the great revolutionary, and my man of the 20th century, Fidel Castro. They went on show in a Mexico City gallery on Tuesday. Most of them were taken after Fidel stepped down as leader in 2006. They're intimate black and white shots taken by his son, Alex. And I'd certainly like to see them come to London, Alex, if you're watching. And I just mentioned in passing my splendid book on Fidel, still available in all good bookshops and on Amazon, or even from me. I chaired a press conference in the House of Commons during the week about the secret courts that the British government wants to set up, all the better for torturing you and extraditing you anonymously. Here's how it went.
Today's campaign launches with an impressive amount of support already. We're very grateful that Respect MP George Galloway is hosting today's press conference from Westminster Hall, the home of British democracy. And we are joined by quite an array of speakers. Their voices of disapproval over government plans to introduce secret courts are already building in momentum. Cage Prisoners intends to lead the call for an end to this ill-conceived piece of legislation, which many fear is a product produced on the back of US pressure. This isn't the first time the USA has tried to meddle with British law and impinge on British sovereignty. The very one-sided US extradition treaty is a case in example. Among those expressing concern is Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister and Liberal Democratic leader, who is on record as saying that the security services cannot be allowed to ride roughshod over the principles of open justice. And Lord Ken MacDonald, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, is more concerned about government ministers using secret courts to hide awkward or embarrassing moments, citing national security as the reason.
All of us are horrified, I think I can say on behalf of all of us, though we all come from different political backgrounds and perspectives. I think I can say on behalf of all of us, that we are all horrified by the secret courts idea. The very idea of secret courts is redolent of Guantanamo Bay, even if our victims will not be sent to Guantanamo Bay. The very idea that justice should not just be done, but be seen to be done as being a crucial safeguard in this country for 1,000 years almost, where the idea of trying people in secret, the idea of an absence of habeas corpus, the legitimate demand to the state that they produce a person and justify their deprivation of his or her liberty. These are core values in any democracy, and they have been, despite all the vicissitudes of recent years, they have been and remained a core value of the English legal system. I have little faith in Parliament. I have little faith in the House of Commons, little faith in the House of Lords. But I had and have still some faith in the courts and the justice system as being, as I've said before, one of the last uncorrupted parts, relatively speaking, of the unwritten British Constitution. So when the government proposed, in the name of national security, to introduce secret justice, secret courts, people from all political persuasions. The Right Honourable David Davis, for example, is leading the opposition here in the House of Commons, a man not just a Conservative, but on the right of the Conservative Party. This is something that isn't party political. It's about whether you believe that justice has to be fought for and defended or not, irrespective of one's political point of view.
Closed justice, not open to the scrutiny of the media or the public, is no justice at all. And these closed courts further undermine an absolutely critical principle of the British legal system, that everyone is equal before the law, because what it's doing is putting the government above the law. And we have to look at the context in which this is all happening. You have to consider that it's happening while we're having an utterly indefensible privatisation of the coercive force of the state in terms of the police, the jails and the military, leaving those services utterly further unaccountable to the public, to the politicians. It's clear overall that this government, and it's very sad that this government contains the so-called Liberal Democrat Party, is an absolute threat to our basic rights and civil liberties that people have fought for and died for over the centuries. The fact is, there's absolutely no evidence that there's any need to curtail our liberties in this way. Ministers have not been able to put forward one single example of a case that hasn't been able to proceed because evidence wasn't able to be presented. There's simply no evidence that's necessary. And also, we're looking at the Leveson inquiry, the whole context of that, the fact that up and down the country, senior police officers are facing very serious accusations and some have been convicted. It's more important than ever that evidence is open to public scrutiny. Now, within the Green Party, Caroline Lucas, our MP, has spoken out very strongly on these issues, as has Jean Lambert, our MEP for London, who wrote an article that I'd urge you might find interesting in a journal called Archers, addressing the whole issue of secret trials. And in that she said that as leader of the EU delegation to South Asia, she found it really very difficult. She was going to countries and asking them about their human rights record and asking them about the way in which trials were not being properly conducted. And they could turn round, or even they didn't even have to turn round. She knew that she was coming from a place where trials were no longer being openly conducted before full scrutiny.
Good afternoon, assalamu alaikum. Secret evidence, secret courts, secret justice. I would never have thought 2012, after having faced and been subjected to secret courts and secret evidence and secret justice in Guantanamo, that we'd be discussing this in the British House of Parliament today. It didn't make sense. There was something in Guantanamo called the Combatant Status Review Tribunals that were held in 2004. I received a letter from my lawyer, Gareth Pearce, at that time when I was in a cell that measured 8 foot by 6 foot. Do not take part in these hearings. They are not acceptable. They are secret courts, and you will not get to see the evidence there against you. They also had in these places something called the personal representative, which I see is an equivalent almost of the special advocate, that they will be arguing on your behalf, but they don't know what your behalf is because you don't get to see that evidence. Now, the reason I think it's very important to know why we're here, why is there a justice bill being passed, and I can tell you, it was a very odd meeting that took place between former Guantanamo prisoners, 15 of them on one side, and various members of the government on the other side. It was the oddest meeting you can possibly imagine, but this was what was happening after the British government had been taken to court by us for complicity in torture, false imprisonment, and rendition. What had happened was that after the government had spent tens of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money fighting against us, to say that they were not involved in this torture. After the documents were disclosed in court, some very, very heavily redacted, that showed very clearly that the British government knew exactly what was happening to us, why it was happening to us, and who was doing it, that they sued for peace, that they sued for a settlement, and they said that we don't want to fight this anymore, and we will offer you an X amount of compensation. But there was a caveat, and the caveat was this. If you don't take this, we will be introducing a new bill into Parliament. And that bill will allow for such cases not to be heard in future except in secret. That's why we're here. And if you want to understand as has been said by other speakers, that this indeed is in the civil courts. We're talking about the civil courts. But there were three actions taking place simultaneously. One was that David Cameron had ordered an inquiry into the treatment of detainees. And that fell on its head because it was boycotted by everyone, the prisoners, the former prisoners, the lawyers, the human rights group and so forth, because it wasn't going to be clear and transparent, because it was going to have an element of secrecy that we would never get to see evidence from those intelligence officers who we either saw physically beating us, like in the case of Shakar Amir, whose head was physically smashed against a wall in Bagram while MI5 watched, or in the cases of others like myself who were sent to Guantanamo because the MI5 had given false information to the Americans. And it was this that was the secrets that they wanted to prevent coming out in the open. And it was for this reason that the inquiry ended in the end, and also because a police investigation for the first time in the history of this country was taking place. Police officers had come to speak to us, not to ask us if we were terrorism suspects, but to ask us what crimes had been committed against us by our own government, for the first time in the history of this country. They were unable to conclude their proceedings or the investigations in the case of Binyam Mohammed for lack of cooperation. But something else happened then. The rebels in Libya stormed the headquarters of the mukhabarat, or the intelligence agencies. And therein they found documents that incriminated directly British intelligence and the government for the handing over and rendition of at least 2 individuals, all based on secret evidence. But not only that, the SIAC, that Sergei Hussein was referring to, the Special Immigration and Appeals Commissions, where did they get their secret evidence from to begin with? Again, the answer was in the hands of the rebels who'd stormed the headquarters of Gaddafi's mukhabarat, or intelligence services. They found the names of all of these men who were placed on control orders here in the UK in those documents. And the level to which this is taking place is astounding. Recently, I took a trip to Syria a couple of months ago. And upon my entry there, I met a Libyan individual. And he told me that he used to live in Syria. And what happened was that he was detained in Syria and then sent to Libya. But why? A phone call was made by one of the Libyan dissidents here in the UK to his friend, to the same Libyan man, while he was living in Syria. That phone call was intercepted by MI5 and had it handed over to Syrian intelligence. He was then detained, beaten, tortured, and sent to Libya and held in the same prisons where all of these other individuals were held. So the story of all of this secrecy, as reported in The Guardian today, is not about national security, though that's what the government will always claim. It's about national and international embarrassment. It's about trying to hide the truth when the truth is staring us all in the face. And it's about trying to, it's important to remember that the names that they've mentioned here, and as in the report that the government has internally discussed, that The Guardian has mentioned today, it says that the likely recipients of this secret hearings are going to be black and Asian men of Muslim origin. So in the climate of this Islamophobia that exists, in the climate of what's taking place all around the world, does it make sense that Britain would regress back into the Dark Ages and try to hold in secret what everybody knows is taking place?
We're here in Parliament, which, if it means anything, must mean that this is the place to defend liberty, this is the place to defend democracy, this is the place to defend justice, and that's why we decided to have this event.
So the fact is, as George said, we're now in what's often known as the mother of all parliaments, a place where many of the rights that are now enshrined in UN law were first encoded and first established. It is really tragic and sad that they're under threat here, but the positive message is, as Yvonne said, there's resistance to this right across the political spectrum. There's people who are going to stand up for our human rights here in Britain, for the right to a fair, open trial, and I congratulate all of you on joining them. Thank you.
And now it's time for some fighting talk after this. This is Fighting Talk, where I regularly have a go at what's irking me. And what's irking me now, as I'm off to Venezuela for the presidential election campaign, is the repeated attempts by the US and British media to paint President Hugo Chavez as some kind of dictator. Mark this: Hugo Chavez has won more elections and more referenda than any political leader on the planet. He wins over and over and over again in free and fair democratic elections. And still, Fox News directly and other media like the Bush and Blair Corporation, the BBC, implicitly, he's described as a dictator. Why is it that a man who's won all these elections can be so described? I'll tell you why. Because when he wins those elections, he uses the democratic power that they have invested in him to steadily transform the political and social landscape of Venezuela, an oil-rich country of 26 million people who in the past were almost all utterly abandoned by the oligarchy, who swapped power Tweedledee and Tweedledum and distributed the oil wealth amongst themselves, shipping most of it to the United States of America. Chavez, on the other hand, has absolutely transformed the health, education, and social status of the masses of the people in Venezuela, including the indigenous people of whom he is partly one himself. Hugo Chavez is one of the greatest political leaders that the world has ever seen. He's a revolutionary man. He's a fearless man. He has stood up to all the brickbats and worse, including military coup d'etat, that have been thrown at him. He is unafraid, and that's what the power in the world doesn't like. They have no time for people who are unafraid, because they are afraid of them. Because a man like Chavez wants nothing that the big powers can offer him, and he has nothing that the big powers can take away from him, because his power comes from the people. So I'll be on an aeroplane to Venezuela in a few hours' time. God willing, I'll report back to you on another great Hugo Chavez victory. Viva the Venezuelan Revolution! Viva Comandante Hugo Chavez! I'm afraid, though, that that's all we've got time for. God willing, there'll be more Real Deal at the same time, in the same place, here next week. I've been George Galloway. This has been The Real Deal on Press TV, and you have been a marvellous audience.